Imagine laws written 2,000 years ago still shaping the air you breathe, the rules you follow, and the society you live in. What ancient Roman rules do you still obey today? The answer will surprise you. The story of Rome begins not with its emperors, nor its soldiers, nor even its towering monuments, but with something far subtler, far more enduring: its laws. Rome understood, better than most civilizations that came before or after it, that the power of a society was not merely in the sharpness of its swords or the wealth in its treasuries, but in the permanence of its rules. These laws, etched in a stone, memorized by citizens, and enforced by magistrates, became the invisible skeleton of the Roman world, supporting every action, every dispute, and every act of obedience or defiance. In the early years, the 12 Tables were created, a simple, almost austere collection of rules, yet one whose implications were immense. They dictated everything, from the rights of patricians and plebeians to the punishments for theft, assault, or disrespecting property, and even defined procedures for marriage, inheritance, and contracts. These were laws not only to be obeyed, but to be internalized, forming a framework that connected the lives of ordinary citizens to the ambitions of the state, creating an order that was both comforting and terrifying in its thoroughness. It is remarkable to consider how radical this was at the time. Other societies had customs, traditions, and unwritten expectations, but the Romans codified them, giving permanence to what had previously been fluid, giving teeth to what had been invisible. To live in Rome was to be constantly aware of the rules, and to follow them was not simply an act of obedience, but a means of survival. Every citizen, whether noble or commoner, slave or freedman, navigated a society that measured them not only by their wealth, strength, or lineage, but by their adherence to these laws, which at times were merciless, at times protective, and always absolute. Magistrates enforced them without hesitation, punishing those who transgressed, rewarding those who followed, and thereby embedding the principle that legality was inseparable from life itself. And yet, the brilliance of the system was that it was not static. As Rome expanded, as the empire grew, as new challenges arose, the law adapted, absorbing new ideas, integrating conquered peoples, and shaping a civilization that could endure for centuries. Even today, nearly 2,000 years later, the echoes of those laws remain, not merely in textbooks or museums, but woven into the fabric of modern life. The concept of codified law, of rights that can be claimed and obligations that must be fulfilled, originates in these early Roman decrees. When you pay taxes, when you sign a contract, when a court adjudicates a dispute, you are participating in a system whose roots were planted on the Forum, under the gaze of Rome's magistrates and senators. Rome's laws were not merely administrative tools. They were instruments of power, designed to shape thought, behavior, and society itself. And in that shaping, there is both order and quiet terror. Because to be subject to a law is to surrender a small portion of freedom, to accept a structure you may never fully question, and yet live within its invisible boundaries. The permanence of Roman law also created a kind of historical immortality. While emperors came and went, armies rose and fell, and cities crumbled, the principles codified on stone tablets survived. They traveled across centuries, influencing medieval kings, shaping early modern governments, and forming the skeleton of contemporary legal systems. There is a subtle, almost imperceptible presence of Rome in every courtroom, every city council, every civic institution we encounter today. The Romans may have believed that the empire itself would last forever, that their military might would guarantee immortality, but it was the law that endured beyond the marble, beyond the blood, beyond the collapse of empires. In this way, Rome continues to speak to us, to shape us, and to govern us, even in ways we do not consciously perceive, and to recognize this is to acknowledge that history is not distant. It is in many ways still alive, still quietly demanding obedience, respect, and recognition. And that is the hidden power of Rome's written word. The Roman Empire was not built on might alone. nor on the courage of legions that marched across continents, though their strength was undeniable. It was built on roads, countless miles of carefully engineered paths that connected cities, towns, and villages, stretching across mountains, valleys, and rivers with an elegance that belied their practical brutality. These roads were more than stone and dirt. They were instruments of power, silent channels through which the empire projected its influence. Every road was a line of control, a line of observation, a line of dominance, linking distant provinces to the heartbeat of Rome itself. Soldiers could move swiftly, messages could travel faster than any whisper, and goods could circulate in a web of commerce that ensured the capital benefited from even the most distant conquest. In this meticulous planning, the Romans understood something fundamental. Control is not merely enforced by armies at the gates, but by presence, by infrastructure, by the invisible hand of organized systems that make rebellion inconvenient, supply impossible, and obedience practical. The brilliance of these roads was matched only by their reach. The famous phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," was not just a poetic exaggeration, but a literal reality. Merchants, generals, couriers, and travelers all funneled toward the center, where the pulse of power could absorb, direct, and manipulate their movements. Each stone laid was a reminder that the empire was watching, and in that awareness, people bent subtly, unconsciously, to the order imposed upon them. Even distant villages, which might have seemed isolated, were tied into a larger system that dictated commerce, military movement, and political communication. In essence, a citizen living on the edge of Gaul or Hispania might never see Rome directly, yet the roads ensured that Rome's influence reached them in every transaction, every interaction, and every law enforced along the way. But roads were not simply tools of efficiency. They were also instruments of intimidation. The knowledge that a legion could arrive at any village, on any morning, within a predictable time frame, shaped behavior as surely as any law. Revolts were discouraged not merely by the threat of punishment, but by the sheer inevitability of control. Every mile of road carried with it a subtle psychological weight, teaching obedience, reinforcing authority, and creating an empire that could endure because its people, even far from the capital, felt its presence constantly. Trade thrived, armies moved, and the pulse of Rome spread outward, touching every corner of the known world. And today, we live with echoes of these ancient paths, though few of us walk them or recognize their origins. Modern roads, highways, and even trade routes trace lines that Rome first carved into earth and stone. The concept of connecting distant cities for commerce and communication, of creating infrastructure to maintain central control, is a Roman inheritance we rarely notice. We drive along straight, engineered roads, transport goods efficiently across borders, and operate under the same principle that guided the Romans 2 millennia ago, that power, stability, and influence are inseparable from the structures we build and maintain. The quiet, almost invisible lesson of Rome's roads is that civilization is less about conquest and more about control, less about strength and more about design. In these silent, enduring pathways lies a history that continues to govern our movement, our trade, and in subtle ways, our lives. Rome's government was a web of power, influence, and subtle manipulation, carefully designed to appear orderly while hiding the constant struggle for control beneath its polished surface. The Senate, the Assembly, the magistrates, each part of the system had its role, its privileges, and its silent threats. The patricians, the elite families who claimed ancestral power, controlled the Senate, shaping policy and law to protect their wealth and influence, while the plebeians, the common citizens, were allowed representation in the Assembly, a body that appeared democratic yet was constantly balanced by the invisible hand of Rome's elite. This tension between power and representation, between appearance and reality, was one of the greatest achievements of Roman political design. It maintained order while channeling ambition, allowing the city to grow, expand, and conquer without collapsing under the weight of its own internal conflicts. The brilliance of Roman governance lay not just in the distribution of authority, but in the careful management of perception. Laws were passed, decrees were made, and magistrates held trials. Yet behind the scenes, personal influence, patronage, and alliances dictated outcomes just as much as any written rule. A senator's word could shift policies, a magistrate's favor could determine a citizen's fate, and the assembly, while technically giving the people a voice, often simply ratified decisions already made by those with wealth and prestige. The system taught an enduring lesson. Governance is as much about the unseen structures of influence as it is about codified laws, and those who understand these structures can shape society in ways that are both subtle and absolute. The Roman model was also brutally pragmatic. Power was not abstract. It was measured in votes, in armies, in loyalty, and sometimes in blood. Political rivals disappeared in silence or through orchestrated violence. Rebellions were crushed swiftly, and alliances were maintained as much through fear as through respect. Even within the Senate, disagreements could be deadly. Speeches were tools not only to persuade but to manipulate, to intimidate, and to signal allegiance. For citizens of Rome, living under such a system was a careful exercise in understanding hierarchy, knowing when to speak, when to comply, and when silence might be the safest choice. The lessons of obedience, compliance, and subtle negotiation were embedded in daily life, ensuring that the structures of power were reinforced by behavior, by social expectation, and by an ever-present awareness of consequence. This influence did not end with the fall of Rome. Centuries later, scholars, kings, and politicians would look to the Roman model as a blueprint for governance, adapting its lessons to medieval parliaments, early modern republics, and even contemporary democracies. The principles of representation, checks and balances, and structured debate trace directly back to Rome's careful orchestration of power and perception. Even the names of offices, the forms of legislative discussion, and the rituals of civic duty carry echoes of a civilization that understood control, persuasion, and hierarchy better than almost any other in history. Modern governments, from democratic assemblies to advisory councils, retain the DNA of Roman political thought, a hidden thread connecting our lives to the streets and forums of a city that existed 2 millennia ago. And yet, Rome's legacy is not merely structural, it is psychological. To live in a society influenced by these systems is to internalize certain expectations about authority, law, and representation. The tension between the governed and the governing, the subtle negotiation of power, the quiet calculation of influence. All these patterns persist today, sometimes imperceptibly, in the way citizens interact with institutions, obey rules, or challenge authority. In understanding Rome, we see not only a civilization of marble, armies, and conquest, but a civilization that shaped the very way humans think about governance, order, and societal structure. Lessons written into the fabric of our modern world. Lessons that echo quietly, insistently, from the Forum to the present day. When we speak of civil rights today, we imagine universal principles, protections designed to ensure fairness and justice for every individual. Yet in Rome, the concept of rights was far more conditional, far more fluid, and at the same time, astonishingly influential on the centuries that would follow. Citizenship itself was a precious commodity, granted selectively, layered with obligations, privileges, and exclusions that defined the boundaries between belonging and alienation. A Roman citizen could own property, participate in legal proceedings, and even appeal to magistrates, while a non-citizen or a slave was largely invisible in the eyes of the law, treated as property rather than personhood. The cruel reality of this system was that rights were never universal. They were a tool of control, a way to reward loyalty, to enforce obedience, and to maintain the hierarchical order that kept the empire functioning. Yet the very existence of these codified rights planted seeds that would grow far beyond Rome. The idea that individuals possess certain legal protections, that obligations and duties can be defined and enforced by law rather than by arbitrary will, was revolutionary. Roman jurists spent years debating, refining, and interpreting these laws, creating precedents that would form the backbone of legal reasoning for centuries. Concepts like contracts, inheritance, marriage regulations, and protections against arbitrary punishment originated in Roman civil law. And though initially reserved for a narrow class of people, these principles gradually inspired systems that extended rights more broadly in later civilizations. Every modern courtroom, every legal contract, every civil proceeding carries a trace of Roman thought, a faint echo of the delicate, often brutal balancing act between privilege and obligation that governed life in the empire. The tension between liberty and subjugation, between citizen and outsider, was never more evident than in the lives of slaves, women, and conquered peoples. Slavery was ubiquitous, a cornerstone of the Roman economy. Yet slaves were sometimes afforded limited protections, such as the possibility of manumission or legal intervention by a patron. Women had some influence within family and society, though always constrained by male authority and societal expectation. These limitations, stark as they were, framed early notions of legal protection and social responsibility, teaching that rights could exist even within a hierarchy, and that law could both oppress and protect, depending on whose perspective one considered. This duality is perhaps the most haunting legacy of Rome's civil law. It demonstrates that rights are neither innate nor static, but constructed, conditional, and manipulable. Yet within these constraints lay the foundation for the modern idea of justice, that law could define relationships between people, between citizens and the state, and even between rulers and subjects. When we navigate our own legal systems today, when we consider contracts, marriage, property, and obligations, we are unknowingly tracing a path back to Rome, to the careful, sometimes harsh decisions that shaped who was included and who was excluded, who could act freely and who was bound by circumstance. The profound lesson of Roman civil rights is that systems of law, even when imperfect or cruel, have the power to endure, adapt, and influence societies long after the civilization that created them has faded. Rights, privileges, and obligations are tools of civilization, tools that can protect or oppress, tools that shape behavior, expectation, and social order. And in understanding how Rome wielded these tools, we can better see the invisible lines that continue to govern our own lives, the inherited structures that quietly shape the way we interact with authority, with law, and with each other, echoing 2,000 years into the present. The heartbeat of Rome was not only its armies or its laws, but its economy, an intricate system that flowed like blood through the veins of the empire, sustaining power, ensuring loyalty, and reinforcing control. Money, in the form of coins, was more than a medium of exchange. It was a statement of authority, an emblem of Rome's reach, and a subtle instrument of influence that touched every citizen, every merchant, and every province. The designs stamped into Roman currency bore images of emperors, gods, and victories, a constant reminder that the empire and those who ruled it were omnipresent. Even the smallest transactions, the humble exchange of bronze for bread, carried with it the weight of Roman order, a microcosm of power enforced through the quiet, persistent authority of commerce. Trade was another essential artery. Roads, rivers, and ports channeled goods across vast distances, ensuring that even the farthest corners of the empire felt the pulse of Rome. Grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Hispania, and luxury goods from the East moved seamlessly through a system of taxation and regulation designed to enrich the state while maintaining the flow of resources necessary for stability. Economic control, in many ways, was more subtle, yet more enduring than military conquest. Armies could march and conquer, but the prosperity of cities, the satisfaction of citizens, and the functioning of markets ensured loyalty, discouraged rebellion, and gave Rome its unparalleled longevity. Every coin, every trade, every tax payment was a thread in a vast tapestry of governance, weaving obedience and dependency into the fabric of daily life. The Romans also understood the psychological weight of wealth and currency. By controlling the production of coins, by regulating trade, and by imposing taxes strategically, they could encourage growth, manipulate behavior, and reward loyalty. Citizens quickly learned that prosperity was tied to compliance, and failure to participate in the system could have consequences ranging from social ostracism to legal punishment. The empire's economy was thus not only functional but instructive, teaching lessons about power, control, and the inescapable link between obedience and opportunity. Every financial exchange reinforced the empire's invisible presence, reminding people that Rome was not simply a distant government, but a system woven into every aspect of life. Even today, traces of this Roman understanding remain. Modern economies, banking systems, trade networks, and even monetary symbolism echo the lessons learned 2,000 years ago. Governments continue to wield economic tools to influence behavior, stabilize regions, and project power, much as Rome did with coins, trade, and taxation. The very concept of centralized financial control, of leveraging commerce to maintain order and authority, is a legacy of Roman pragmatism and ingenuity. In this way, the empire, long gone in physical form, still governs us through inherited systems of trade, currency, and economic expectation, silently shaping our daily lives and our understanding of value, obligation, and societal structure. The story of Rome's economy is, in essence, the story of civilization itself, a lesson in how power could be embedded in everyday actions, how authority could be exerted through the flow of wealth, and how societies survive and thrive when systems are designed to connect, control, and sustain. The coins you see, the taxes you pay, the trade networks you rely on, all are echoes of Roman brilliance and foresight, reminders that even in the mundane, the empire endures. Through economy, Rome did more than enrich its rulers. It molded behavior, secured loyalty, and created a civilization whose lessons, both subtle and profound, continue to govern the modern world. By the time the empire reached its peak, Rome had done more than conquer lands, build roads, and craft laws. It had woven itself into the very fabric of civilization. Its legacy was not only in the monuments that scraped the sky or the arenas that echoed with blood and spectacle, but in the subtle, invisible systems that continue to shape our lives today. The calendar you follow, the months you mark, the legal principles you rely upon, the languages you speak, the architecture you inhabit, all carry traces of Roman design. The lessons of order, structure, and control, embedded centuries ago, continue to govern not only governments and economies, but the routines and expectations of daily life. Rome's influence extends into our cities and streets. Urban planning, with streets laid in precise grids, forums at the center, public spaces for trade and law, all stem from Roman ingenuity. The concepts of zoning, civic centers, and public utilities have distant roots in Roman urbanism, demonstrating that their obsession with structure was not mere vanity, but a blueprint for functional societies. Even the legal and political frameworks we take for granted, from courts and senates to codified rules and civil obligations, are echoes of decisions made by magistrates, jurists, and senators millennia ago. These systems were designed to endure, to educate citizens in obedience, fairness, and consequence, and to transmit order across generations. But Rome's legacy is not only structural, it is psychological. It resides in the way humans perceive authority, in the expectations of obedience, in the implicit trust that laws, systems, and institutions are meant to maintain order. From childhood, we learn patterns that have their origin, in subtle ways, in Roman society: respect for rules, recognition of hierarchy, and understanding that civilization is sustained not only by force, but by participation and compliance. Even when we rebel, we do so within frameworks established long ago, frameworks designed to absorb dissent without collapsing. The invisible hand of Rome shapes not only nations, but behaviors, thought patterns, and social expectations. The reach of Rome also reveals itself in culture. Literature, philosophy, rhetoric, and art from the empire have influenced education, debate, and creativity across centuries. The very way we write, argue, and conceive civic life owes much to Roman models, teaching us to value persuasion, logic, and precedent as they did. Religion, festivals, public ceremonies, and even notions of civic pride and collective identity trace lines back to Roman innovations. In this way, the empire that fell over a millennium ago still dictates the rhythm, order, and morality of societies far removed from its original borders. In the quiet moments, when we move through daily life, we rarely notice that we follow laws, patterns, and routines inspired by a civilization long gone. Our calendars, our coins, our courts, our streets, and our systems of government all are whispers of Rome, echoing silently, persistently, in ways we seldom question. To understand Rome is to understand the invisible scaffolding that underpins our modern existence, a reminder that the past never truly disappears,